The civil rights movement in the United States was a decades-long struggle by African Americans and their like-minded allies to institutionalize racial discrimination, disenfranchisement, and racial segregation in the United States. Through the movement, we meet many courageous and ambitious characters looking to create a brighter, more equal future. Rosa Parks was an important figure in the civil rights movement. She was born in 1913 in the wonderful state of Alabama and became active in the civil rights movement at a young age. In 1955, Rosa Parks entered a bus and sat in the front, which was reserved for white people at the time. The driver ordered her back, and when she refused, the police were called. She was put in jail for refusing to give up her seat and then lost her job. This courageous act led to the Montgomery bus boycotts, which led to the integration of unsegregated public transport in Montgomery. After the boycotts, she moved to Virginia and later Michigan. She continued to give money to the movement and even lost many things fighting for civil rights. This includes being evicted from her house. Because of Rosa Parks' legacy she left behind, she was known as the mother of civil rights movement. The Little Rock Nine were a group of 9 black students who enrolled in a formerly all-white Central High School in Little Rock, Arkansas in September 1957. Their attendance at the school was a test of Brown versus Board of Education, a landmark 1954 Supreme Court ruling that declared segregation in public schools unconstitutional. On September 4th, 1957, the first day of classes at Central High School, Governor Orville Faubus called in the Arkansas National Guard to block the black students' entry into the high school. Later that month, President Dwight Eisenhower sent in federal troops to escort the Little Rock Nine into the school. It drew national attention to the civil rights movement. In its Brown versus Board of Education of Topeka decision issued May 17, 1954, the U.S. Supreme Court ruled that segregation of America's public schools was unconstitutional. Until the court's decision, many states across the nation had mandatory segregation laws, or Jim Crow laws, requiring African American and white children to attend separate schools. Resistance to the ruling was so widespread that the court issued a second decision in 1955 known as Brown 2, ordering school districts to integrate with all deliberate speed. On March 7, 1965, John L. Lewis led a march with over 600 peaceful protesters across the Edmund Pettus Bridge in Alabama, marching to the state capitol 54 miles away. They were protesting for the murder of Jimmy Lee Jackson, who was murdered during a protest by police and who was denied voting rights. State troopers lined up along the bridge wearing gas masks and fired tear gas into the crowd. Then they advanced into the crowd, swinging at the protesters with clubs. This shocked the nation and propelled the fight against racism. This event was a turning point in the civil rights movement and resulted in a few main changes. 2 speeches were delivered by both Martin Luther King and the Alabama State Capitol, and by Lyndon B. Johnson before Congress. Voting rights were also passed quicker, and the introduction of a Senate bill happened after this day. In 1961, freedom rides were organized in the Deep South to test the 1960 Supreme Court decision of Boynton versus Virginia. It stated that segregation in railway and bus terminal facilities serving interstate passengers was illegal. In May 1961, 13 black as well as white riders departed from Washington, D.C. by bus en route to New Orleans. A few days later, in Anniston, Alabama, One bus was firebombed and riders on another were assaulted. After the Anniston incident, students from Nashville Freedom Movement resumed the freedom rides to Mississippi throughout the summer by taking buses, planes, and trains where they would be arrested and jailed. In the letter shown, James Farmer, National Director of the Congress of Racial Equality, or CORE, asked for help in raising money to support the freedom rides.
Now the time had come. I was riding in the front of the bus. I don't remember how many hours it was from Atlanta, but if it was 6 hours, actually by trip, it was 60 hours of the fear of the mind. So much so had this tension built up that as we went through the countryside and we looked out and I saw the red clay, we passed Tuskegee Institute, where I had gone to school under segregated circumstances, where I had been in the Air Force as a Negro cadet, where I had graduated as a Negro officer who could not eat in the White Officers Club as I prepared to go and fight the American cause. I looked at Tuskegee. I was so doggone scared. Not afraid, scared. That I wanted to get off the bus, get out, and stay at Tuskegee. Tuskegee was a familiar name. Montgomery was a place of hostility. Montgomery, I remembered from 1940. I remembered Montgomery from the Capitol. It's the capital of Alabama. On the Capitol steps, a shoeshine boy, not more than 18, head split open from behind, and blood streaming, somehow gushing over the front of his face and down. This was 1940, but that has always symbolized Montgomery, Alabama to me. Finally, we arrived in Montgomery. We were going into Montgomery, as we later found out, in the face of a court order, a federal court order that said no one would go in as a freedom rider. This was Montgomery. This was the hostile Montgomery in which the beatings had just taken place a few days prior to this of the Freedom Riders. We pulled into the bus station of Montgomery, Alabama, and now the moment of truth had arrived. The bus pulled into the station. I got ready to get up. I started to stand, and my legs wouldn't hold me. This is fear.
The Voting Rights Act of 1965 aimed to overcome legal barriers that prevented African Americans from exercising their right to vote. It was signed into office by President Lyndon B. Johnson, the assumed president upon the assassination of President John F. Kennedy. During the Civil Rights Movement of the 1950s and 1960s, peaceful activists in the South were subjected to various forms of mistreatment and violence. Some even had to face state troopers who attacked with nightsticks, tear gas, and whips. Those who were able to vote were often tricked out of voting, such as election officials telling them that they had gotten the date, time, and/or place wrong. Some people were also uninterested in voting because, mostly in southern states, black voters had to recite the entire Constitution of the United States or explain the most complex provisions of state laws in order to vote, which was very hard to accomplish for most voters. Luckily, in May 26, 1965, the Voting Rights Bill was passed in the Senate and a month later in the House of Representatives. Michael King Jr. was born January 15, 1929, in Atlanta, the son of a reverend. As a child, Martin faced prejudice all the time. He was most affected by Jim Crow laws, which would later be brought up in his I Have a Dream speech. King was a very educated man. He skipped the first and last years of high school, entering college at age 15. In 1948, King graduated Morehouse College with a Bachelor of Arts degree in sociology. Much of his ideas and momentum for equality came from the writings of Thoreau and college. Later, Martin King graduated with a Bachelor of Divinity degree from Crozer in 1951. In 1955, King earned a PhD in theology from Boston University. King then started to use the platform of the church that his father was a pastor to deliver speeches. As the years move on, King builds up a larger base of supporters and publicity. On August 28, 1963, Martin gives his famous I Have a Dream speech.
I have a dream that one day this nation will rise up and live out the true meaning of its creed. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal. I have a dream that one day on the red hills of Georgia, the sons of former slaves and the sons of former slave owners will they be able to sit down together at the table of brotherhood. I have a dream that one day, even the state of Mississippi, a state sweltering with the heat of injustice, sweltering with the heat of oppression, will be transformed into an oasis of freedom and justice. I have a dream. My poor little children will one day live in a nation where they will not be judged by the color of their skin, but by the content of their character. I have a dream today.
King delivers a very powerful speech on the increase of civil and economic rights for African Americans. He also speaks to end the racism in the United States. Unfortunately, Martin Luther King Jr. was assassinated April 4th, 1968. We have lost a large key to the fight for civil rights, but we are left a spectacular legacy of excellence. In the end, the civil rights was a great success. Its effects have been felt all the way to modern time. Examples include the public desegregation and inclusion of black people in modern affairs. Since the movement, we have seen black folks in movies and sports. Additionally, the 44th president was a black man named Barack Obama. None of this would have been possible without the civil rights movement.